Okay. All right, we've got some folks coming in. I'm just going to start my housekeeping spiel first, then we'll get going. So, hi everybody, I'm Tessa O'Connell. I'm the Public Outreach and Communications Manager at the Natural Areas Conservancy. Thank you so much for joining us for our second and last event for Climate Week NYC. It's all interconnected climate change in New York City's plants. So one thing I just want to mention we're on Zoom webinar, so feel free to use the chat and Q&A function. If you have any questions, any technical difficulties, things you want to ask the panelists, and we will do our best to incorporate those into the program so that you can have your questions answered. Like I said, it's all interconnected, climate change in New York City's plants. One thing we're asked about, well, we focus on a lot at the NEC is climate change solutions, natural climate change solutions. But one question that we always ask and like to think about is how is climate change actually affecting the trees and plants that we work to conserve and care for? And so that's one of the questions we'll be exploring today, as well as a variety of other related topics. So I want to introduce quickly our speakers, and then they will take the program away. We have two Claras in Georgia with us today. So I'll start with Clara Pregetzer, who's from the Natural Areas Conservancy. She's our Deputy Director of Conservation Science. She's worked in a variety of roles at the NAC since 2013, from leading the forest assessment, creation of the forest management framework in partnership with NYC Parks, and starting the Forests and Cities program, which is a network of 12 cities focused on urban natural areas management. She has a Bachelor of Forestry from Northern Arizona University, a master's in ecology and evolution biology from the University of Tennessee, and a PhD from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Next, we have Georgia Silvera Siemens. She is an urban and community forester. She is the founder of Local Nature Lab and directs Washington Square Eco Projects. Georgia is the organization of Black Botanist Week, and she's a researcher with articles in urban forestry, urban greening, and arboriculture and urban forestry, and writes about urban birds and bylines in Popular Science and Audubon. And last but not least, we have Clara Holmes. She will also be moderating the rest of the program. She's a plant ecologist with NYC Parks, and most of her fieldwork consists of monitoring vegetation, pre and post restoration, and tracking rare plant populations in NYC Parks. Clara holds a Master's of Science from Pace University and a Bachelor's of Arts from the College of Charleston. So thank you, ladies, for joining us for this event. That's the end of my little part. I will shut my video off and let you guys take it away, and I will monitor the Q&A. Don't forget to put your stuff in the chat. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Tessa, and welcome everybody to this lovely event the Natural Areas Conservancy has started and sponsored for us today. As Tessa mentioned, I'm Clara Holmes. I'm a plant ecologist with New York City Parks, and I am joining this event today from our office in Manhattan. So there's a lot going on, and rules dictate that the mask wearing is in effect. So please bear with us for that. So before we really dive into some questions, I thought maybe I would give Clara and Georgia a chance to sort of further introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about the work that they do and how it ties a little bit into climate change and the plant communities of New York City. So Clara, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Clara, and thanks, Tessa, for that introduction. It's really nice to be here with you all on Climate Week in New York City. I'm tuning in from my home in Queens, New York. And yeah, like Tessa said, I'm the Deputy Director of Conservation Science at the Natural Areas Conservancy. We are a nonprofit that works in direct partnership with New York City Parks and are focused on the conservation and management of New York City's over 10,000 acres of natural areas. So that includes forests, wetlands, and grasslands right here in New York City. We were started in 2012, and I've been with the Natural Areas Conservancy since 2013. My work has focused on research, data collection, vegetation assessments, and I worked really closely on developing the forest management framework. And since our organization has started, we've released a variety of different reports that all connect plants and natural habitats to their management needs and also address climate change needs. So the forest management framework, the wetlands management framework, the strategic trails plan, and we've also been partnering with about 12 cities in the US to understand how other cities are managing natural spaces in their cities and ways we can learn from them. I have a background in forest ecology. I've worked in New York City for over 10 years. And yeah, love urban ecology, land use history. I've worked in a little soil science and plant ecology. And yeah, really excited to be in this group and talk about plants and climate change.
Wonderful. Thanks, Clara. I know the Natural Areas Conservancy has got a lot going on, and it's nice to have you here and have your expertise to share with this topic. Georgia, can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you're up to these days?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm tuning in from my home office in Manhattan, the Greenwich Village neighborhood. As Tessa mentioned, and I want to thank her for that wonderful welcome, I founded Local Nature Lab. We actually launched that formal nonprofit this year, but we started out as Washington Square Park Eco Projects in 2013. And as the name implies, it's really focused on that park. We have a couple of ongoing projects, most of them around biodiversity monitoring. So we do a bi-weekly wildlife survey, which is very bird dominant. We also have a phenology project. So we're tracking roughly 10 trees in the park, and we do seasonal observations for the entire year. We also have environmental education programs, one of which is Explore Birds, which has been our most popular program and is still on hold really because of the pandemic. But that's a program that we bring to public spaces in the city. We have bird specimens, other kinds of biofacts, and we provide a literal hands-on experience for folks to get them to not only think about the diversity of birds in New York City, but to sort of share with us and each other their own bird experiences. My formal training is in urban forestry, and I refer to myself as an urban forester. I started out doing community forestry work in New Haven, then moved to Boston, where I managed the city's street tree planting programs. Between then and now, I completed a PhD program where I was looking at urban forestry policy in Northern California. So I also really like to think about that aspect of the work. So sort of hands-on and policy are things I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Wonderful. I really like how a lot of the work you do in Washington Square Park encompasses many fields of ecology, connecting them all together with sort of this hyper local focus on a single park as an example of the way different parts of our natural systems interact with each other. So I think that's a great expertise to have and to bring to this discussion. All right, so let's dive into it a little bit. According to the New York Botanical Gardens 2018 State of the City's Plants, there's over 2,000 species of plants in New York City that have been recorded as being present here since the early 1800s. And that represents over 160 families and almost 730 genera of plants. So we've got a lot of species diversity in New York City. And of course, we do know one caveat there is that a portion of those have gone extinct since the early 1800s to now, but we do still have a lot of diversity in our flora. And so one of the big questions here, since scientists are constantly sort of arguing that climate change is sort of helping bring on this sort of fifth extinction that we're going through, I wonder how you think climate change is going to have an impact on the diversity of the flora of New York City, and if it's going to have an impact even. Georgia, since you've sort of focused a little bit in Washington Square Park and a phenology project, I think that I'll let you answer that question first and see what you think about that.
Georgia, you're on mute.
Thanks to both Claras. I want to start out by answering that question by taking something out of the sort of preface that you gave, Clara, about the extinction of biodiversity in New York City and how some of that has been the result of loss of habitat and development. And I want to say that there are many issues that are impacting biological diversity in the city, and climate change is but one of them. I think that we have to consider biodiversity and climate change together. And this is something that is not just coming out of my mouth, but is something that 2 of the UN agencies put forth this year, that we have to consider these processes as sort of happening in tandem, and we can't solve one without the other. I certainly don't want to engage in a sort of like rivalry between these 2 factors. What I want to do is to say that biological diversity can help us buffer against some of the impacts of our changing climate, and our climate that's already changed, actually. So I think even the way we talk about climate change, it's like not this thing that's going to happen, but it's already happening. And we know that that's affecting our plants. And I know that Clara can speak really intimately about that because she's doing the work in sort of natural areas and forests in Washington Square Park. So our phenology project is still fairly young. We have about 2 years of complete data, but even with that, you know, we've noticed that spring is arriving earlier in the park over the course of just 2 years of data collection, and we'll see that's, you can't do any sort of trend information from just 2 years, but even within that time, just noticing the difference. So climate change is affecting biodiversity, but I also want to say that we can use biological diversity as a way to mitigate climate change. And the reason why I think we should lead with a biodiversity lens is then if we don't, it often gets left out of the conversation. Climate tends to be very, at least what I'm hearing, it tends to be very tech-driven solutions. And I don't want to see then biodiversity added on at the end, sort of tacked on, and it's not very meaningful or it's not integrated. And then the final point of that is, I mean, biodiversity, I think, is a viable and meaningful tool in our basket to mitigate climate change effects, but there are also so many other benefits that can be derived from biodiversity. And we, you know, sort of academics, right, and everyday folks have spent a lot of time bringing these benefits into popular culture. I wouldn't want those to fall out because the lens is totally shifted to let's solve climate with tech.
Absolutely. You know, I think one of the things that you said about seeing spring happen a little earlier and how it relates to biodiversity, of course, there's been the analogy of the rivet effect. You can have a number of rivets fail on their own slowly, and it doesn't have a major effect on the systems until the last one comes out. And I think if we increase biodiversity in some of these landscapes, the mismatch with pollinators pollinators might help be buffeted, right? The more plants we have available blooming in the spring over a longer period of time offers additional resources to those that might be missing what they normally get because of these earlier springs. So Clara, as Georgia mentioned, you're sort of on the ground a lot, doing a lot of the research in our forests. Do you believe climate change is having an impact on our flora? And if so, how?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And I was kind of like scrambling to write a few notes from what Georgia said. There were so many good things in the points that you made. And I think I love how, Clara, you started sort of talking about the rich diversity of New York City's plants, because I think it's something that many people often don't think of when they think of New York City, that maybe biodiversity and conservation is something that we shouldn't worry about here in New York, but 11% of New York City's landscape is natural. So that includes forests, wetlands, and grasslands. We have over 35 different habitat community types or vegetation community types. And I think that's something Georgia mentioned is, it's really important to have these intact ecosystems and these intact habitat types for the functioning of ecosystems. And so a lot of that exists here in New York City. We have our native tree canopy in natural areas or our forested natural areas is dominated by native tree canopy. So I think there's a lot of reasons to think about why biodiversity conservation is important here in New York City. But I think to answer your question directly, of course, climate change is impacting our vegetation. And I think that happens in a variety of ways. And so I think the climate change trends that we're experiencing here in New York City include increased precipitation events, so heavier and more frequent storm events. And so we've experienced a lot of those just in this last month. And so even when you see a tree blow down, so maybe the soil gets saturated, and the wind starts blowing and that tree blows down, that's a direct impact of climate change on plants in our ecosystem. But that in itself can almost be sort of a catalyst for habitat loss, which is something that Georgia mentioned too. So habitat loss can occur by buildings and kind of removing plants from the environment, but it can also happen in sort of this sequence of events that might be sort of a slower churn of how climate change is impacting plants. But a tree could blow down, and because it's been warmer, invasive vines could come in and take up that space that maybe other native flora would have taken and make a more homogeneous plant community there, and ultimately lead to a decrease in biodiversity. So I think there's so many ways that climate change is impacting our plant communities in New York City, and some of them we don't even know yet. I think a lot of the monitoring that's happening in the city can start to tell a story, but I think there's so many ways, from a seed not germinating because of a drought. I think about this summer in June, how hot it was and how seeds might be looking for a little water to germinate, but maybe then a storm happens and they get washed away. So that could be, this kind of like microscopic event that's sort of happening, but all of those things compounded over time can lead to a shift and a change in plant communities. And in fact, that's what we've seen in New York City over time. And so it's kind of hard to think about all of the layers of land use history and fragmentation, habitat loss, and then also increased temperature, increased storm events. And so I think all of those things added up, we are seeing a shift in plant communities. From research that we've done, we know that our forest canopy is native, but it's nearly 20% less native in the understory and seedling layer. And so we're sort of thinking about that as being the next generation of plants that are going to be populating our tree canopy. It kind of suggests that we're seeing a shift and that we're in trouble. And I think kind of tying that to climate change is I think hard to do kind of directly, but I would suspect that climate change is definitely a big factor in that.
Yeah, I think you know, that's a couple of really good points you made there, Clara. First of all, the concept that, you know, when we have these big storm events, we're not just losing our street trees, which is where I think a lot of us see those impacts in terms of our urban nature. You know, we see the street trees down more regularly than we see the forest trees down. And as you said, it can have these sort of compounding impacts, and sort of, you can see climate change affecting our forests in ways that you might not initially think of, right? And with the coming of invasive species into that canopy gap, losing the native species diversity in that area will then have additional compounding and impacts up the levels of ecology, right? But I think you also hit on a really important point about management. I think what some of us find so frustrating is that we often feel like we can see the freight train coming. Like, we know there is a shift in our forest structure that is coming down the road, and there are so many different levels to that, and what specifically is being caused by climate change versus other compounding influences. And I think that can be really frustrating, because we don't necessarily know exactly how to respond. So I wonder if in your work you have some specific tools maybe that the Natural Areas Conservancy has been working on to sort of help us sort of buffer the loss of our flora from these extreme shifts, or if you have ideas about new ways we should be thinking about planting and restoration in our urban environment.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I think it's something a lot of people are struggling with, is like, what should we do? Like, how are we going to, you know, restore or manage our natural habitats to be resilient in the future? And sort of, what does that mean? And I think there's a lot of research is dedicated towards that. And I think, but I think there's like no silver bullet that's sort of like, this is the one approach that we need to take to protect natural ecosystems and habitats. And so I'll mention a few things. I think sort of first and foremost, I think thinking of diverse strategies, and sort of, if you think about like maybe a portfolio of investment, I think you want to have a really diverse portfolio to sort of mitigate any risks that might come up. And so I think that's something that's important to think about, is, you know, not just doing one single strategy when you're thinking about restoration and management, and to really look at what's happening in that ecosystem that you're trying to protect, manage, or restore, and kind of taking into account factors of land use history. So a lot of Staten Island was farmland just 100 years ago. And so how does that impact the vegetation communities that we see today? And how might we incorporate some of those land use legacies into the trajectories of the forest that might be more resilient in the future? But I'll also mention that the Natural Areas Conservancy has developed a tool, the first tool, and it's now I'm like blanking on exactly the acronym for it, but it's a planting palette tool to suggest species combinations that will be resilient in the future. And so what this tool does is it takes into account all of the native ecosystems and plant communities that occur here in New York City, and then pairs that with climate projection data for individual species ranges. So it looks at 23 different factors, from soils to light availability to disturbance response, and kind of aggregates all of that data into a tool that suggests sort of which species might be well suited or well adapted to thrive in the future. But we're really careful in that tool to not suggest that you don't plant something that might be not predicted to thrive. I think all of that sort of is important to kind of take into account at an individual site level and species level, because I think if you think about some of the patterns that some research has shown about species migrations or species shifts, that there's a lot of ways that can happen, and a lot of reasons why we might be seeing species shifts that might not be directly due to climate change. So I think I'm sort of like giving that caveat because I think it's important to, use the best available information that you have. And I think the tool that we have gives a really robust look at not just the native plant communities that occur here in New York City, and suggest species lists that could allow those communities to transition and be well adapted in the future, but also sort of, gives the best available climate science on sort of what we know at this time, and that's always changing. So, so that's available on our website, and I think if anyone is developing planting lists or is thinking about even just wanting to learn more about the plant communities in New York City, it gives you a long list of plant species and groups them into communities. And so so we're working closely with the Parks Department to kind of cycle that from plant material and planting stock if we're going to a restoration site, but also thinking about forests at different stages and structures. So if we're looking to just kind of buffer the seedling layer in an already existing forest, we might use a different approach than if we're sort of starting from scratch. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's a great tool for people to take a look at, because I do think it combines a lot of elements of what climate change might likely do with what the natural communities are, which I think is a very valuable combination. On the other side of that, you also mentioned multiple types of landscapes, and really your work being in the natural areas and George's work kind of at least currently focused on a more landscaped park are these two sort of different kinds of habitat types in New York City. And I wonder, from your perspective, Georgia, how you think we should be approaching plantings or restorations in the context of.
Thank you for this question. I am such a fan of small parks, neighborhood parks, and I could talk about this for a very long time, but the tool that Clara mentioned, and there are sort of other ways that people are thinking about so-called climate-ready species, climate-ready planting palettes. And some of this is happening in very specific parts of the landscape. And I would love to see that same attention be given to green spaces in the city that are local and nearby to where people live. This might be too general of a statement, but in some senses, these nearby local green spaces are sort of more vulnerable because they don't have management plans. Their palettes are quite historic in a sense. And so if we aren't paying attention to plant biodiversity in our small parks, local parks, nearby green spaces, including street trees, then only certain parts of the city will be climate resilient in terms of a species palette. So I definitely want more attention to be paid, and some of this research, not necessarily to be trickled down, but that non-natural areas are on the sort of same level of consideration as natural areas, or even parks of like a certain acreage, right? I want to say that I also feel this is a little bit not a little bit, this is an equity issue. We know about the many benefits that you can get for biodiversity, and sort of to limit biodiversity to specific parts of the city where they aren't necessarily accessed on a daily basis, I think is problematic. So we also have to think about how these tools may or may not sort of participate in like inequitable access and inequitable benefits to folks. I just want to, the city, I'm not a manager. My organization doesn't have management power over the park, but we do advocacy, and I would like to appeal to our elected officials to focus on green spaces that are closer to where people are. Sort of an example of this kind of thinking, we, many folks are probably familiar with urban heat islands, and I feel like for a very long time, that was the sort of buzzword about cities. Cities are really hot. They're hotter than their rural counterparts. So we're going to plant trees everywhere to cool them. And now we're talking about extreme heat, and what extreme heat does, it magnifies the urban heat island effect. And so, you in a forested area in the city, that even within a city itself, you're dealing with hot spots. And so we need to be looking at the places that don't necessarily have the stocking level that other parts are, and really focus on those places in our city. And also that biodiversity piece is critical, like biodiversity being the first lens when we're looking at green space and public lands management in the city.
Absolutely. I think the idea of sort of approaching management in sort of our landscaped parks is very different from how we manage our natural areas. And I do think coming into this climate change era where we're already seeing the impacts, there might need to be some sort of adjustment there so that we can see the benefits of what the natural areas offer in these landscaped parks as well. And taking sort of a step back from the very focused of our plant species in New York City and thinking more holistically about landscapes, I think the concept of monitoring is very important, which is something Clara has mentioned, and it helps us inform our management in the natural areas and possibly should in our landscape parks as well. But I wonder, Georgia, if you also see how you see the ability specifically for community parks and landscapes to act as buffers for our own, for our human activities in the New York City, and how you see that shift over the next couple of decades. I know you've worked a lot with both the communities and in our natural areas and sort of tying those two together. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how you see the role of our parks playing out in the years to come.
Well, I'll sort of do the thing that lots of people said last year during COVID. We really, if you didn't know how beneficial parks and green spaces were, you definitely figure that out very quickly if you stayed in the city. They provided, they were space. They were the space that we needed. They were the safe spaces that we needed, both sort of physiologically, but I think also emotionally and mentally. And especially last year at the height of the pandemic in this region, you weren't traveling by subway or bus to get to, the 500-acre park or the 100-acre park. You were going to the closest park, the closest landscape area in your community for space. And I think these local places are going to continue to become more important as we experience extreme weather events, whether that's sort of the kind of heat that can kill you, and maybe your apartment, you don't have AC, maybe you cannot afford air conditioning. And so maybe your block needs to be like as well stocked as it could to keep your building cool because you're unable to afford that. Or maybe you need to be going to your park because there's just like deeply refreshing shade, and then you can go home when your building is a little bit cooler. We can even think about I don't know, there's also just kind of like a basic human joy that comes from being in green spaces. And I think that's part of the work that needs to happen. It's not just simply plant biodiversity, and we've definitely sort of alluded to this, right? Like the plants are kind of the scaffolding or the framework, and then we get other species that are sort of interacting always, insects, birds, and this is sort of all part and parcel of what people go to parks to experience. And you can experience that in 10 acres, and you can probably take it to the next level if those 10 acres were managed in a different way, right? I don't think that managing for biodiversity and recreation need to happen in two separate spaces. I think there's a lot of alignment between those two things, and that's what I want to see, and that's the direction I hope my work will push the city in.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is in addition to the diversity of plant species, we need a diversity of landscapes and scattered throughout the city, because I think what we're really saying here is that we have a compounding problem, right? We know inequity exists in New York City, and we've seen how climate related events exacerbate these inequities, and how natural resources planning, including situations where there's a more impervious surfaces in some area and a lack of parklands or natural areas, contributes to the problem of climate change and inequity. And of course, these are not simple problems, and I don't think that we're going to find very simple solutions. Like Clara, you mentioned the silver bullet approach, and I don't think that is there, and it's going to take a lot of conversations and strategies to come up with sort of a multifaceted approach here. But I wonder, Clara, if you have any ideas or can tell us a little bit about what maybe the Natural Areas Conservancy or some of the research you guys have been doing, how it might help inform new strategies that we could put in place to help mitigate some of these inequities and their impacts.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think I'll answer that by also reflecting a little bit on some of what Georgia said about the importance of different landscape types and green spaces and sort of the diversity of having something nearby. And I think it kind of makes me think around the different values that different landscapes can have, and how important it is to have a diversity of landscape types or green space types close to where people live. I think, natural areas can provide can be really important for habitat for flora and fauna. We know that's where a lot of our intact ecosystems exist. We know that it's where most of the trees in New York City exist. It's where most of the carbon is stored. We know that larger intact forest stands can provide really important cooling benefits that can sort of span neighborhoods. But we also know that having a tree right next to your house can lower your air conditioning bill, keep your building cooler. Having a park or a place to go within a 10-minute walk can be critical to health and well-being. And I think that in COVID was so true. I can sort of speak personally to that. I did not have a park nearby. I did not live in a place with outdoor or access to the outdoors. And that really, really gets to you during a place when or during a time when you're really cooped up. And so I think in a lot of natural areas are in the outer boroughs, where we know that in research done by our partners at the Forest Service, that 50% of people that visit parks might not ever experience nature outside of New York City. And so really thinking about what equity means and sort of what different types of green space the city is investing in, protecting, and how that's done across, all 5 boroughs and all neighborhoods and all blocks. Because I think access to parkland, and access to green space is not equal in the city. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that the city You know, a lot of cities in general are not built sort of with a green foot forward. It's you know, has not really been the point of cities, even though when we think historically, you know, most cities were established because of natural resources. When we think of New York City as sort of the, you know, a coastal city that is close to multiple waterways and the natural resources of, you know, beaver pelts or oysters or fishing, and sort of like what the natural resources have given the city and sort of why it's established, and sort of carrying that through time. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of equity and really taking a holistic view of green space in the city. And, you know, natural areas are a piece of the pie, landscaped parks are a piece of the pie, but so are green streets and cemeteries and backyards. And how do we kind of look at everything together and think about the holistic and multiple ways that green spaces are protecting our city and helping our city, and sort of, but also the individual needs of people in the city and sort of who has access to those benefits and who does not. So yeah, I think there's a long way to go, but I think it's something that our organization has been starting to think about with our strategic trails plan and how to make natural areas feel safer and more well marked. And then also just thinking about continued protection and improvement of our existing natural spaces. And so I think just investing in the natural areas we have can increase and improve the benefits that they can provide and continue to provide for the future.
Right. You know, I think what we're all sort of in agreement on here is that natural areas or landscaped parks, all of these different kinds of landscapes in the city really should be approached as to some degree as a part of the city's infrastructure, right? And they need to be viewed that way, and they need to be treated and managed to some extent and given the same resources in that way. And I think you also made a really interesting point, Clara, and Georgia, I've heard you make a similar point in other conversations we've had about how even though cities sort of developed in and around natural resources, and that's sort of why they developed, for a long time, cities haven't, they've sort of been a place where landscapes and natural habitats don't exist. And I was wondering, Georgia, if you would take a minute and reflect on that, because I know it's something that that you've really talked about before, about how this is sort of a historical problem, how cities are not natural areas anymore, even though that's not where they originated.
Yeah, thanks for that, Clara. The kind of anti-urban discourse that's, I think, at the basis of the foundation of cities in the US, right? I mean, just cities are an unnatural thing on the landscape, which is far from true. And I would say perhaps in the last, I don't know, 20 or so years, 30 years, there's been a lot of research to counter this myth that there's no ecology in cities, there's no ecosystem function in cities. Nature, as you would find it in cities, is actually not nature, it's like something else. And then in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, this kind of like pro ecology vision of nature of cities is entering the popular imagination. And so, I mean, it's still in the very early phases, I would think, this kind of trickle down. It's not like a gush. It's still very much a trickle down. And I think, you know, while academics and policy wonks might have shifted their mindset, lots of other people haven't. And if we're thinking about how we want to manage our city to optimize biodiversity, ecosystem function, and ecosystem services, like we want to create a city that's resilient to climate, we have to do a lot of work to have like a cultural mind shift about what cities actually are, and the fact that, yes, cities are actually, you can find big N nature in cities. And we kind of just, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or an anthropologist, so I don't have the solutions for affecting that like cultural mind shift, but it's work that needs to be done. Cities are where lots of people currently live globally, and cities are where lots of people will live in the future globally. And if we want, we don't want to live in places that are constantly bombarded by extreme weather events. And so we have to make the places that people are going to be living in healthy across like many different axes. And so, I want to get that anti-city discourse like so far behind us.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start shifting to taking a few questions to the audience. And while some of you out there get your questions in the chat for us, I want to just sort of end this portion with a moment of reflection, and maybe we can all say one of the things that we have experienced in our jobs that kind of keeps us going, right? For those of us in this field, we are possibly more acutely aware of the potential side effects of climate change, right? And that can be a little overwhelming for us at times. And for me, there are times where I'm walking around New York City and I come across a plant species that I just didn't know existed in New York in the most unlikely of places. And that's the sort of thing that for me takes me a moment, gives me that moment of like, oh, right, this is why we keep going in the face of all odds. So I wonder, Clara, if you have had a moment like that, or if there's something specific about your work that is similar.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. I feel like I've had so many little moments like that, probably similar to you, where like anytime I'm out away from my computer and in a forest, wetland, or grassland in New York City, I always end up feeling more inspired and more refreshed, but also kind of recognizing the work that needs to be done. But I can think of probably one moment really stands out in time, which is kind of early in my career in New York City, and I was working in Van Cortlandt Park, which is up in the Bronx, and I was taking the subway there, the one train, over an hour to get there, and then I'd spend the day looking for vegetation in Van Cortlandt Park. And my family is not from New York City, and so they were like, what are you doing there? There's no forest there, like, and I myself didn't really know what I was doing there. And I barely knew that there were, healthy forests, wetlands, or grasslands in New York City. And every single day, I remember just being like surprised at these huge oak trees and huge tulip trees and kind of rocky outcrops, and just kind of astonished at sort of the beauty of the landscape. And I was learning plants in New York City then and finding rare native plants. But there was a really hot day in June where I was sitting down on a log eating lunch, and then a great horned owl came down and swooped and landed on this branch and kind of watched us while we were there. And I just remember being sort of like in awe at how the habitat there was, supporting this great horned owl, and just how there's so much life, around us. And even now in Queens, I live across from a cemetery, and there's a really degraded, invaded forest patch kind of right out my window. But there's this family of raccoons that sort of like, comes back and forth, and I'm not like that happy about them, but I'm like, hey, that's their habitat right there. And so I think I'm just sort of inspired sort of anytime I'm out in the woods and the wetlands here.
Yeah, Van Cortlandt's an amazing place, and raccoons got to make a living too.
Yeah.
Georgia, what about you?
Well, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off Clara P's story and go a little bit away from like small park patch. I think it was earlier this year, my colleague and I and a friend went out to, and this is a little bit of a sad story, went out to Graniteville Wetlands on Staten Island. We were there to do a bird survey for an organization that's had been trying to prevent the demolition of that wetland. And, you know, we had heard that, or the reason the group wanted the bird survey was they had been told that there are not any birds that hang out there. So we went and we found plenty of birds, nesting, breeding birds, including a great horned owl. The female adult was on the nest with an owlet. And that was my first time seeing great horned owls in real life. And it was, I don't want to say magical because it was real. It was awesome, like AWE, awesome. And it's imprinted, like it's a memory forever. And, you know, sort of thinking about this whole conversation, again, yes, nature exists in cities, big N, nature exists here. And when you take away a piece of that, you're not just sort of taking away some trees, right? You're taking away a habitat that's sort of more than trees, and then all of the other benefits for people that go alongside with that habitat. And so I think just thinking about the ramifications of what we do in the landscape and how more than ever, the consequences can be severe and devastating.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we have a couple of questions here in the chat, and one of them is kind of quick, so I'm going to go to that first. Clara, someone wants to know what the term you used is for the 35 biodiversity zones in New York City. I think they're looking for maybe the 35 vegetation types, and maybe you can just give a couple. We're pretty close on time, but a couple of explanations of what those are.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy if you want to email me. My email's on the website. I can send you a list. But yeah, it's the vegetation community types that we've mapped for New York City. And so we have a list of them and associated plants. So that would be like oak hickory forest, oak tulip forest, maritime coastal forest. And then it gets down into the details of the plants that are associated with those plant community types.
Great, thank you. So a couple of other questions here. Have any of you heard or have any experience with the eco-district planning approach, which has been used in other countries and to a limited extent in the US? It's not something I'm familiar with. Clara or Georgia, are you familiar with that?
No, it's not. I've heard the term before, but I wouldn't be able to talk very well about it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that either. I'd love to learn more. I know that there's, I don't know if this is at all parallel, but there are some like special planning zones or districts. There's like a zoning for special natural area districts in Staten Island, I believe, but there's some other people on our staff that have worked specifically on that, and maybe some of our colleagues at New York City Parks might have more information about that, but I have no idea if that's, you know, a similar kind of concept or not.
Great. Sorry, we're not able to dig into that one any deeper. Another interesting question here is if there's any sort of research or understanding about the relative biodiversity of or resilience within the backyards of New York City, which I think is a really interesting way to look at landscapes, since that's not something I think any of us really work in, right? I mean, I have a very small patch backyard I can climb through a window and access, but beyond that, you know, it's not a place I work. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on what this biodiversity would be like, or how those landscapes sort of contribute to the city's landscapes and resiliency.
I think this came up in one of our earlier sort of prep conversations. We were talking about the sort of carrots, like incentives for folks who actually own yards in New York City, and what that could look like to get people to make their yards as permeable as possible, as biodiverse as possible. if folks really want to sort of dig into this question, I know that there are researchers who are looking at private yards as spaces for biodiversity in cities. And I think some of that's happening, I think in the Southwest, but I'm going to turn that to Clara.
Yeah, I don't work in, I haven't worked in that specifically, but when we were talking about this before, there's a new sort of plan and coalition called Forest for All that is looking at all green space, public and private, in New York City. And this came up in a conversation we were having about tree canopy that exists on public and private land and how to increase tree canopy, and I think sort of inherently biodiversity and sort of other associated benefits in private property. And I know that there's some programs and initiatives like tree giveaways for private landowners, but I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And living in Queens, I know I've walked around my neighborhood and seen a lot of completely paved concrete backyards. And I think there could be a lot of ways to sort of incentivize having more permeable surfaces, more educational opportunities for sort of like, how do you care for and plant vegetation that won't flood your home, your basement, how to direct water. I think that's a huge concern that I've sort of heard, anecdotally talking to people around, is like, we're paving it just so the water gets off of our property. We don't have to mow it. We don't have to worry about it. But I think, there is a lot of private land, and I think that could definitely add to the resilience of New York City. And then I think also in cities where New York City is, there's a lot of apartments, there's a lot of high-rise buildings, but other cities are much more sprawling, where there's a lot more single-family homes where residents more frequently will own a yard. And I think it could be interesting to kind of look at some models from other cities if that is done elsewhere.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
So the kind of barriers, and Clara mentioned them, and this is work, research that I know Lara Roman in Philadelphia with the US Forest Service has written about, and others like folks in Detroit, that there are real barriers to folks participating in greening projects, whether that's in the public sphere or on their own property. And some folks who might be living in a home might be renters. And so issues of like maintenance and costs become really important. So any sort of incentive program needs to factor the cost to the renter or homeowner. So biodiversity, there's a cost for making our cities biodiverse, and we need to think about that in the planning process as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we've only got about a minute left, and I think one of these last questions up here is a really valuable question to end on. So I was wondering, or someone in the audience was wondering, if either of you could offer suggestions on how to communicate to the unconverted about the importance of caring for the environment. Georgia, why don't we start with you?
Well, I mean, that's a big, hard question. I think if there was the answer, there would be 100% conversion. I always like to start with experience, like experiential learning. And, that's been my sort of personal background, but also my professional background. And I'll just give an example, and it goes back to the bird program. Like when we have specimens out, and these are specimens that are made from birds who collide with glass windows, we'll get questions about, wow, or comments, I didn't know that you could see this bird in New York City. Where can you see this bird? Why is it here? And so I think there's a way that you have to bring nature to where people are, and don't assume that people don't know about the nature in their city and the sort of sort of systems that are happening, because I've also found that New Yorkers are really knowledgeable, and like not just like ornithologists, but everyday people are really knowledgeable about the ecology of their like street or park. And so I think thinking about exposure, but then also elevating people's experiences and knowledge can be two ways to sort of help tackle this problem.
Yeah, I think storytelling is a very valuable tool in the environmental education world. I also think, for me personally, I think trying to explain the likely impacts, for example, this participant mentioned an interaction with someone who was about to sweep trash into a storm drain. And I think, kindly trying to explain that has a pretty large, could have a potentially large impact on, beings other than us or other humans in the city, and that we are all essentially one community. I know that approach doesn't always appeal to everyone, but it is an interesting, it can lead to an interesting conversation. Clara, what about you? Any final suggestions on how to communicate?
I mean, I'll just agree with Georgia. I think experience is probably the best approach, and inviting someone to a tree planting event, to go for a hike, to experience something and sort of share, the things that you love about nature and conservation, I think, and trying to share that with other people, I think can be powerful.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for your time. This was a great conversation. I hope all of you enjoyed it, and thank you all for participating. I'll send it back over to Tessa to see if she has any other final moments.
Hi, I just want to say thank you again to our lovely panelists, and thank you, Clara, to moderating that wonderful discussion. I think we really covered so many wonderful topics that are all very relevant and top of mind, especially this fall season for everybody on the call. So thank you again. We will post this recording on our NEC YouTube page. So if you know of anybody that maybe missed this event and would want to watch the recording, we'll share that link out after the event wraps up now. Otherwise, thank you again for tuning in. Thanks to our panelists, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, everybody.